it's a history lesson, it's a handbook, it's a guidebook. Maybe explain what sank the movement, like that's how it started. Or it could be like, why did you decide to write this book? Did you wake up one morning and say, huh?
No, I didn't. It's so funny. So my background in activism comes from the student movement, and the student movement in Canada is a place where there still is feminist organizing. There are women's centers or women and trans people centers, and there someone can stumble in and learn about feminist theory, right? One of my friends who who I reference in the book, was dumped in first year and went to the women's center to like cry on their couch, and created this like feminist beast who is now an activist and a writer. And she just wrote a book called Before the Parade, which looks at queer history in Nova Scotia. And so I come from that world, but I was not at all involved in the Women's Center. I wasn't involved in any of that. And I never really felt like feminism was something that I cared about. Like, I was a feminist. I understood that we needed to have a gendered lens in understanding the problems of society and patriarchy. But I personally was like, I got other struggles. I'm more interested in working people. I'm more interested in other kinds of struggles. And so, you know, part of it was because I went to Ryerson University. If you know anything about Ryerson, you'll know that it's a university that is light on theory. And so I got to breeze through my undergraduate degree without ever reading theory at all. And then I didn't really feel part of like that world of gender studies, feminist thought and action. Except, of course, feminism finds you one way or another. You need it. We all need it in different ways. And so it was always kind of present in the activism that I was doing. And as I got elected at Ryerson and I became a bit of I had a bit of a profile, I very quickly figured out that life is absolutely brutal and shitty for women and for non-binary people who take up place, right? To take up their space or take up their place. And so the spark for the book was actually around the Canadian women's marches in 2017. I was at home in Quebec City. So I'm coming from you at the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, which also has traditional claim over parts of Toronto as well. So nice connection between Quebec City and Toronto. You can look up that history if you're interested in how that happened. The Canadian women's marches, they were sparked by Donald Trump's inauguration, right? And so they happened on January 21st, 2017. And what happened a week later? The shooting at the mosque in Quebec City. That's about 5 kilometers from here, from where I live. And the year after that happened, the Canadian Women's March was happening almost at the same time that I was helping to coordinate the 1-year anniversary of the shooting attack at the Centre Culturel Islamique in Quebec. And I was saying to myself, and then I posted online, where is the women's movement today? Like, how is the women's movement organizing around Donald Trump and doesn't see Islamophobia, far right violence, as its struggle? Like, what, and then what is the message coming from the women's marches? And the messages were as diverse as the people present, right? The messages were everything from reproductive justice to murdered and missing Indigenous women to gendered violence it was just everything, right? And it was very clear that we were in a moment, and we are in a moment, where feminism is no longer a dirty word or whatever. People identify as feminists, regardless of gender, of their gender, they identify as feminists. And we have a prime minister who's a feminist, but where is the movement? And why is it the case that the prime minister can call himself a feminist and not be afraid that like 100 feminists with like torches are going to run after him for claiming that he's a feminist, right? How far away from the history of feminist action have we gotten? And so I posted this online, and a book editor was like, "Oh, that's a really interesting Twitter thread." And it was like the only Twitter thread that's ever gotten me such an amount of, work. I was paid $2,000 to write the book, so I can't say money yet. But it was that sparked this journey. And I wrote the outline on my flight to Toronto to do a talk related to the labor movement. And then I met with the editors there. And then the Humboldt situation happened, and I could talk about that if people have questions. And the editors, or the publisher, was like, "Thank you, no thank you." And so then I kind of spent 8 months figuring out what to do with this book proposal that I would not have written had that one publisher's editor had suggested that I wrote it. And so, fast forward, Fernwood amazingly picked it up. And then the process of working with my editor there, who is an amazing editor named Fazila Jua, we were able to construct this, as I was saying earlier to Lana, this polemic talking about what feminism should be, what feminism could do, and what feminism has done in Canada, and what was it about the action that was taken years past that made it so powerful. And I'll just finish this answer by saying, that review from Rain in Rabble is just like, I just was like, oh my God, I can't believe that's such a beautiful review. And she said it was for young feminists, right? And actually my target audience for this book wasn't young feminists, it was new feminists. So people who would say that they were feminists, but had, just like me, never studied the theory, or maybe studied the theory, but not that interested in getting into those really high level academic debates, which are important. I don't also want to denigrate that angle of feminism as well, because of course the academic theoretical approach is really important. But I wanted to, as we say in Quebec, I wanted to vulgarize this world. I wanted to make very difficult to understand sometimes theory palatable to average people who may have studied feminism, may have not studied feminism, may have an idea of what it took to win whatever struggle, may not have had that idea, and try to bring us to a place where we see feminism as a debated, difficult, combative location for feminists to organize around.
Verb.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Well, you've done it, I think, right? Like, I think this should be required reading in schools, and hopefully, once we get it together, it could be. And on that note, talk a lot about the debate about what's missing. Can you tell us, like, what's missing, what used to be and what isn't, and like kind of what you just said there? NAC was the big thing, but do we need a new NAC, or what's the answer?
Yeah, exactly. And I imagine that Judy had a lot to say about these kinds of questions, because of course she was around NAC in the moments where it kind of started to collapse, right? So I come from a school of organizing where, lots of different kinds of people work either within or outside of a structure. And the people that work within the structure are usually united around some sort of basis of a common base of ideology or beliefs, or a statement or something. And then the people that don't work within that structure are either on the outside because they disagree with them, they don't find them radical enough, they find them too radical, whatever. But that interplay between inside and outside a large kind of structure is something I'm very fascinated by. I've been fascinated by this since I was involved with the student movement, and it's a very big debate within the labor movement, right? So people who are unionized or people who are not unionized, and how does that interplay happen? Or if you're all members of the same union, people that hate each other trying to come together and, hopefully fight the bosses for better, whatever. And so, you look at the feminist movement in Canada and the heyday of mainstream feminism, right? And I want to make sure that we're very clear that there's always been feminist action in Canada. Like, there's always been resistance, feminist resistance in this land, on this territory. And that resistance often was done by women who were not white, who were not able-bodied necessarily. And oftentimes their stories have been erased and sanitized out of this history of the women's movement in Canada. And I didn't want to focus too much on history, but I did give you a chapter on history. I thought that a chapter was more than enough on history, because it's great, but it's also history. I love history, but not everyone does. I half love it, I guess. And so NAC played this really important role because it brought together hundreds of organizations with very different political ideologies, And it forced feminists to debate one another on tactics and on strategy. And by doing so, there was this really important interplay between dominant versus less, not subordinate, but like less dominant. So dominant frames of feminism being, let's say, liberal feminism versus radical Marxists, right? That kind of clash, or straight women clashing with lesbian women, right? That kind of classic clash that existed throughout all of the women's movement, but really marked in the 1970s. Racialized women, Black queer women having really radical, very clear critiques of women's organizing, and then the larger organization responding, but then also silencing. So how does that interplay create the sum of the women's movement? And so NAC collapses, and then what happens to this location to have these debates? There's nothing. There's no place that's a broad umbrella kind of structure for us to have these debates. And the people who were taking feminist action in the 1980s, 1990s, and in the 2000s, like the activists are still doing that work, right? You're all probably involved in different kinds of feminist action locally. There's certainly a combative shelter system movement, but as neoliberalism has accelerated, as the demands of life have been downloaded onto individuals from the state, and as the welfare state has been eroded, the ability for people to be combative and activist has been really damaged. And so, you look at some of the radical action that activists within the shelter movement took. Now shelters are like just trying to keep up, right? What was the biggest result of Me Too? Oh, more people are seeking shelter support. It's like, that's great, except we haven't built more shelters. We don't have more people in those places. We don't have more services for them. So then it's like, so what does it take for us to then force change inside government? And it's so funny because we have this feminist prime minister who has done so little feminist public policy that it's like, how does he get away with saying that? How do we have government officials getting away by saying, we support women, we're here for women's rights? And there's been so little done, except the feminist movement then doesn't have that location to be able to confront them, to be able to scare politicians, to be able to make it such that Mariam Monsef, who's the minister of they keep changing. It was women's status of women in Canada, and then they gender affairs or something, like they keep changing the name. But she comes to these events, right? And she comes to protests. And so it's like, sorry, who are we protesting against? You're right here, Oh, but we're all women. We're all in this together. And so in the absence of this like ability for us to come together and debate and say, like, okay, what's the connection between feminism and colonialism? What's the connection between feminism and resource extraction? What's the connection between white women protecting our safety at the expense of racialized women, especially Indigenous women, who've seen rates of violence against them increase, right? As rates of violence against white women have decreased, have been a steady decline in the last 40 years. But we don't have that space. And so the book is trying to get people to think about the need to have physical space, because as we've lost physical space, the internet has really taken hold over a lot of people's minds, thinking, we just need another hashtag, we just need another awareness campaign. I just need to be able to speak my story of sexual violence, speak my story of oppression, speak my story of not getting that promotion, masking that as activism. And what I'm arguing is that we need to have that, but that's not necessarily going to be confrontational activism that then brings in the changes that all those issues that underpin all of those issues.
So I'm going to ask one more question, even though and then open it up. And if anybody has a question, either put it in the chat or raise your hand, because the book really does pose all those questions. And you're quite, even at the beginning, you sort of bookend it with, I'm asking these questions. I'm not saying what to do, but it's like, it's a something, it's a collective, it's a network, it's a federation. So what, even though, and you don't know, and we can all sit here and stare at you and say, hey, tell us what to do, but that's not in the spirit of things.
Yeah.
What is the action? Like, what do we do?
My opinion on this has been very obviously influenced by all of the reading and all of the thinking I did around this book. I think that what is very clear is there are models of organizing that are current, that are working. And so what are those models? Well, one is the incredible activism around migrant worker rights. And a couple of years ago, something like 25 organizations in Canada that do migrant rights justice organizing of some kind came together and formed the Migrant Worker Alliance for Change, which is a national umbrella organization. And the impact of just bringing coherence, national coherence to that movement, you can see all over the pandemic. You can see that journalists have had front and center the question of migrant worker rights throughout the pandemic, even though like other workers have had just as horrible kind of difficult stories or whatever, but the interventions made possible through that uniting organization, bringing together a lot of different migrant rights organizations, I think is a very interesting model. The other model that's very interesting, of course, is a loose network, something like Black Lives Matter. So Black Lives Matter is a feminist, Black-led, queer-led activist or organization that exists in different ways in cities and towns all across Canada. And BLM is really exciting because, you know, it's anchored by like a really strong presence in Toronto, but there's chapters that are loosely affiliated all across Canada. And the second there's something that happens, BLMs all across Canada are able to intervene and engage in civil disobedience and bring people together. And that's a lot less of a formal network than the umbrella organization, the Migrant Workers Alliance for Change. But those are two very interesting models, I think, that are out there. And then there's also climate justice, which I think we can learn a lot from how people are organizing within the climate justice movement as well. And that's a movement that probably resembles feminism more than anything else, where you've got that dominant, where white people have been dominant in positions of leadership, where they've been always confronted by racialized, especially Indigenous activists saying, like, you know, think about this, what about us, what about this, how about we talk about this in a different way? And that there's an incredible diversity of tactics, everything from working with government to, you know, chaining yourself to a pipeline, right? And the thing that I find really exciting about the climate justice movement is it's taken like 20 years for it to coalesce into something that is a little bit more um, uh, bringing people together in a way that you can really see this direct action. But it's being led by young people. And I think that that is really, really important, because if you look at the feminist movements of the 1970s, like feminists again in Canada had always been organizing. It wasn't new, but the 1970s was a moment where the Trudeau government gave free money to people to just do projects, and pretty much all projects were approved. And that was the foundation of the modern system of childcare in British Columbia. That's the foundation of the modern shelter system. It's like so much of feminist action came out of this 2-year window of funding where you've got $100 a week of a salary to do whatever you want. And that was really led by young women. Like it really was young women activists that like there were older feminist activists and people like women involved in the labor movement and other movements as well, who helped to bring sense to a lot of how the organization was structured. But the radical action and the actions that we really remember today were really built in that early 1970s. And those activists then became the Judy Revicks of the world, and you know that managed to fight and win in 1988 the Morgentaler decision. You'll find them, right? Just if you consume like with like really seeking out people and seeing who people are interacting with or promoting or retweeting, you'll find a network of people that you're inspired by. So I really encourage you to consume social media with an eye to that, to see who's consistently putting out interesting stuff and be like, oh, that's very cool. I will follow that person.
That seems like the next best step is follow everybody.
Yeah.
And rise.
Well, and you have Farzana. I mean, Farzana is also someone that you should be watching, and so is Leanne, and so is JL. I mean, these like, yeah. When you're looking in the right direction, you'll find the folks who you should be following.